The fire wasn't meant to kill her. That's what they'd say later, with tight smiles and easy shrugs. That it was symbolic, that it was festive, that no one really meant for her dress to catch, or her lashes to singe, or the hem of her skirt to smolder while she stood there, half shackled to the festival post, like an offering made from pride and poor decisions. But the truth was in the way they laughed, the way the mayor stood with his thumbs hooked into his vest, watching her burn with the same face he used when judging pigs at auction. It began with her no, a soft word, barely above a whisper. She had been taught to say yes to everything in this town. Yes to the coin thrown short at her seamstress table. Yes to the men who pawed her finished work with wine-stained fingers. Yes to the half-compliments and whole leers that filled her shop when the sheriff's men needed their buttons sewn back on. But when the mayor asked, no, announced, that she would be his bride at the autumn bonfire, she had simply looked up from her needle and said no. No makeup. No explanation. Just quiet refusal, with the straight-back dignity of someone who knew what it had cost her mother to bow her head. And that's what stung him. Not the rejection itself, but the way she made it sound like a prayer. By nightfall, the mayor had told the town that the bonfire would be brighter than usual this year. She wasn't jailed. She was honored. Or so the women said, as they tore strips of cloth from her own dresses to make the festival sash. It's tradition, they told her. Just stand still. Be good. You'll see. The sash was red, and the firewood was pine. She stood beneath the wooden arch with dry hay under her feet, arms looped in decorative chains that left shallow red rings on her wrists. The children danced. The fiddler played. Someone tossed a bouquet at her feet. When the fire caught, too soon, too high, someone shouted. But no one stepped in. Not until she screamed. And even then, they waited a moment longer than they should have. Just enough to let the mayor look satisfied. Just enough for the flames to kiss her hem and curl her hair at the edges. Then the chains were cut, the sash torn off, a bucket hurled at her legs, cold and half full. She collapsed into mud and pine needles. They laughed again, not cruelly. They would later say, just nervously. It was all just nerves. Tradition. Pageantry. By morning, she was gone. No one asked where. She walked barefoot through frost-heavy fields, through streams so cold they cut the memory from her knees. Her dress stuck to her back where the burns had blistered, and her hair, once long and brown as tree bark, was now lopsided, half-burnt, smelling of smoke and horse lard. Somewhere near the ridge, she passed a scarecrow and almost apologized for startling it. Her name was Etta. She had once sewn dresses for brides who wept behind her curtains and whispered secrets to her with shaking fingers. She had once drawn flowers on scraps of silk and dreamed of a porch of her own, with morning sun and a single rocking chair. Now she was Ash walking on two legs, and on the far edge of that same ridge, a man watched her pass. He didn't step forward. He just saw her, the way she moved with one arm cradled tight against her ribs, the way her burnt dress clung like she had been sewn into it, the way her breath didn't rise with fear anymore, just weariness. He'd seen soldiers look like that long ago, when the war had taken what it could and left the rest limping home. His name was Callum, 40, maybe 42, a widower of 7 winters. His voice had been quiet even before the loss, but now it was nearly gone altogether. He lived in a cabin with walls thick as a ship hull and silence deeper than any well. He had no neighbors, no animals, just a barn he didn't open anymore, and a single worn coat that still smelled faintly of her. Callum saw her from the hill. He didn't call out, didn't offer help. But the next morning, when he opened his cabin door, there were footprints in the frost heading toward the barn, and inside in the loft, curled against a pile of hay with her back to the world, was Etta. She hadn't asked. She hadn't knocked. She had simply chosen a place that felt less cruel than fire. He left a tin of water near the door. The next day, she returned the tin washed. She stayed in the barn, quiet, not hiding, just resting, like an animal that had been whipped so long it no longer flinched, only breathed shallow and prayed for spring. He mended the barn roof the following week. She said nothing, but he noticed her eyes tracked the new shingles when it rained. He left bread on the fence post. She left stitched patches on his coat where the elbow had thinned. They didn't speak, not for days. Not until a wind came sharp and heavy one night, pushing sleet through the barn slats like knives. That night, he walked across the yard, opened the barn door, held out a folded quilt. She took it with both hands. He didn't say, "You're welcome." She didn't say, "Thank you." But when he turned to go, she whispered something so faint the snow caught it first. "I used to dream of a red porch." He paused, looked back once. "That's a good color," he said. 8 more days passed. Callum found himself watching for a shadow in the window, for the way she'd brush her burnt hair back behind her ear, for the sound of her breath at night, steadier now. Sometimes she sang, not songs with words, just hums, morning doves and wind chimes. He began leaving firewood nearer to the barn, a tin cup, a jar of wild honey. The town said nothing. Perhaps they thought she'd died in the woods. Perhaps they hoped she had. But the mayor, he noticed the silence. He sent a man once to look for her. The man rode out and never came back. Some say he saw her eyes through the barn slats and turned around. Others say Callum met him halfway and didn't need words to turn him back. Whatever the truth, no one else came. Until one afternoon, when the church bells rang too long, a boy arrived at the fence with a note from the mayor, folded neat, sealed with red wax. Callum read it by the stove. Didn't say a word. But that night, Etta found the barn swept clean, the blanket folded, a small stool left beside the door, and the next morning there was a dress laid out. Not new, but whole, mended at the sleeves, blue, with small red embroidery at the collar. She hadn't worn a dress since the fire. She put it on. Callum didn't speak when she stepped onto his porch. He just pulled out a second chair, sat down, handed her a mug of weak coffee, and for a long time they watched the sky together. The mayor's letter remained unopened on the table inside, but both of them knew the town wasn't done with her yet, and this time she would not face them alone. The barn had never been meant for guests. It was the place Callum went when the silence in the house got too loud, a place for rusted hinges, old ropes, warm memories tucked into saddlecloth. The rafters still smelled of her, his wife, long buried beneath pine and prayer, because the last thing she'd touched was the red bridle that still hung near the lantern. After she died, he left it all untouched, as if moving a single thing would make her loss more permanent than it already was. But now Etta moved among the dust and rafters like she belonged to silence too. She never asked questions, never crossed into the house. She swept out the hay with slow, deliberate strokes, mended what she could with bits of twine and leftover cloth, and never looked him in the eye for too long. Not from fear. From something older than fear, dignity. He had lived alone so long he'd forgotten what it meant to listen for another soul's breathing at night. But now her quiet rhythm haunted him through the walls. Her cough when it rained, her shuffle in the straw, the sound of her hand trailing the wooden frame as she moved. One night, he stood outside the barn, listening for her breath, just to know she hadn't disappeared like a mirage. The next morning, she placed a folded note on the fence post. Just one line. "Thank you for the blue dress. I wore it like armor." He didn't reply, but that night, she found a comb wrapped in cloth beside the water tin. That was their way, gesture, silence, gesture. A kind of language that healed the body before it ever asked for words. When the townsfolk passed Callum at the trading post, they didn't mention her name, but their eyes lingered a little longer. One woman clutched her child's hand tighter, and the old man murmured, "Don't poke the mare," like it was a prayer or a warning. Callum said nothing, but when he returned home that evening, he found that Etta had planted small green shoots near the barn wall. She didn't ask for permission. That was the moment he realized she hadn't come to borrow shelter. She had come to stay. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. The next week, the first snow came early. Not a blizzard, just a thin veil of cold white breath laid down over the hills like a warning. He brought her an extra blanket. She accepted it with a nod, and for the first time, he sat on the step outside the barn, while she lit the lantern inside. The light spilled out in gold fingers. Between them, space, quiet, steam rising from mugs, and something else. Not romance. Not yet. But recognition. He saw something in her that looked like himself. Grief that had survived the fire. That night, she spoke. Not much. Just fragments. She told him how she'd lost her mother in childbirth and had been raised by a grandmother who wore black every day of her life, even when it was hot. How she learned to sew by candlelight because that was the only hour of peace the house ever gave. How the mayor used to tip his hat to her when she was young and say, "You'll make a fine wife someday." And how she'd once thought that was a compliment. She didn't say how it all became a nightmare. But she didn't need to. He listened, nodding sometimes, like a tree that had heard every storm but never forgot the shape of the first. And when she fell quiet, he didn't try to fill the silence. He just let her hold them both. The next morning, the town made itself known again. A boy rode in on a nervous pony. He didn't dismount, just held out an envelope, sealed with red wax. This time, it was addressed to her. She opened it alone, inside the barn. She didn't cry, but her hands trembled slightly as she passed the note to Callum at the doorway. It was short. Return by Sunday. The mayor offers forgiveness. And a final chance. No signature. Just the stamp of the county. He read it twice. Folded it back. Then handed it to her without a word. Etta stared out past the fence, where the sky touched the field like a wound. Her voice was thin when she finally spoke. "I didn't ask to be a lesson." Callum looked at her, really looked this time. No one ever does. That night, she didn't return to the barn. She sat on his porch, in his second chair, wrapped in the quilt he'd once saved for bitterest winters. He didn't ask her to come inside, but he didn't lock the door either. They sat in quiet again, but now the quiet had weight. Shape. The kind of silence shared by people who have run out of reasons to lie to themselves. In the days that followed, something began to shift. She walked to the creek alone, but no longer flinched at bird calls or broken branches. She washed the blue dress in cold water and hung it by the barn to dry, openly, without shame. Callum saw her touch the scar on her wrist and not hide it. He saw her laugh once, when a squirrel nearly dropped a pine cone on her head. He saw life returning. He also saw the mayor's wagon pass the far ridge on the fourth day. He didn't mention it, just added extra logs to the fire. When Etta brought in a pail of apples one evening, she noticed Callum carving something into wood. It was a small bird, in flight. He'd carved it into the handle of the barn door. Her lips parted. Why a bird? He paused, as if unsure whether to answer. Then, because it never forgets where it flew from, even if it never goes back. She didn't respond right away, but later that night, she sat by the barn and whispered an old lullaby to the stars. She sang for the first time with words, and he listened from the porch, wondering if the song was meant for her mother or for him. The mayor returned on the sixth day, this time with riders. They stayed far enough to not trespass, but close enough to be seen. One of them called out, "We'll be back Sunday, Callum. Town needs to finish what it started." He didn't move. He simply placed a rifle on the porch railing. The man smiled and rode off. That night, Etta didn't look afraid. She boiled tea in the iron kettle and asked if Callum had ever ridden east. He shook his head. Had plans once. Then the war happened. Then life. She nodded. "I'd like to see the ocean someday." He said, "Me too." Even though he wasn't sure if he meant it, or if he just wanted her to stay a little longer. On the seventh night, wind howled so hard the shutters rattled like bones. Etta came inside, not for fear, but because she chose to. She slept by the hearth, curled in the quilt. Callum sat nearby, whittling a second bird, smaller, with softer wings. And sometime past midnight, her hand slipped over his. He didn't pull away. The next morning, the snow fell thick. The barn looked softer and white, but inside, the red bridle still hung untouched. Etta walked past it, ran her fingers along the wood, and then stepped out to the porch. "Will you stand with me Sunday?" she asked. Callum looked at her. "I won't stand behind you," he said. I'll stand beside you. She nodded. The smallest of smiles broke her solemn face. You should finish carving the wings, then. I will. Outside, the snow kept falling, and somewhere behind the trees, the mayor made his plans. But the barn was no longer just a place for ghosts and memories. It had become something else now. Not a shelter. A beginning. The first time Etta stepped into town again, she wore no chains, and that, more than anything, unsettled them. It wasn't the healed skin on her cheek, or the newly hemmed sleeves of her blue dress, or even the faded burn at her temple that curved like a crescent moon. It was the quiet way she walked, like someone who had outlived their own funeral. Some remembered her as the girl at the bonfire, the one who'd screamed when the fire caught her dress and didn't stop until smoke replaced her voice. Others had already rewritten the tale, said she'd run off with a thief, or been taken by wolves, or found penance in the river. But now she stood in front of the general store, her boots dusty, her chin steady, her hands gloveless in the early frost, and they didn't know what to do with her. Callum stood a few feet behind. Not a shadow, not a guard, just there, present in the way a mountain is present, still and not to be moved. He didn't touch her, didn't speak, but his presence was its own declaration. They bought flour, coffee, nails, a spool of green thread. The shopkeep fumbled with the change. Etta didn't flinch. She folded the receipt, tucked it into her coat, and thanked him. They left without looking back. But the whispers began before the door closed. That's the girl from the pit. She ought to be grateful the mayor wants her still. I heard he offered her land, a whole plot behind the church. Did you see her walk? Like she owns there. Callum didn't speak of it when they returned to the ranch, but that night, as Etta scrubbed the new pan in the cold water barrel, she paused mid-motion. They want to rewrite me, she said softly, to make me someone they can pity again. He looked up from a porch step where he sat carving. You're not someone they get to rewrite. She nodded, not grateful, confirmed. The next morning, a letter arrived again, this time nailed to the fence post with a rusted nail. No seal, just a folded page. Callum read it aloud by the kitchen hearth. You will return to the festival this Sunday. The mayor is prepared to absolve and wed. If you do not appear, a charge of theft and vagrancy will be pursued. At the bottom, no one escapes the town that raised them. Etta smiled without joy. It's always forgiveness they offer, never apology. She didn't cry, not anymore, not since the frost hardened her lungs and taught her that survival is a slow kind of war. Callum stepped outside, lit a small fire, burned the letter, watched the edges curl into black wings. The following day, they went to the chapel, not for prayer, but for truth. The preacher, old and kind-eyed, seemed unsurprised to see her. I buried your grandmother, he said, not unkindly. She was afraid of fire, too. Said it takes what the flood leaves behind. Etta placed a folded cloth on the pew. Inside, the mayor's promise ring, half melted. Return this to him. The preacher frowned. He won't be pleased. I'm not here to please, she answered. I'm here to end what he started. Callum stayed quiet until they walked past the bell tower. He'll make a scene. He already did, she said. Now it's my turn. By Friday, word had spread. The town buzzed with it. The girl in the fire, the widower with silent eyes, the porch with 2 chairs. Children whispered legends. Men sharpened knives. Women sewed lace into their Sunday gloves. Etta washed her hair in creek water, so cold it burned her scalp. She trimmed the ends herself, straight across with sewing shears. She lined her boots with wool. Callum watched her from the porch. You don't have to go. She looked up. I'm not going back. I'm going through. He nodded. Then I'll walk beside you. Saturday night, she stitched a new hem on her dress, red thread like flame. She left the ends long, like tongues of fire. In the barn, the red bridle still hung. She didn't touch it, but she nodded to it once, like acknowledging an old pain, long buried but not forgotten. When the sun rose Sunday, frost glazed every leaf, and the wind had the bite of a bitter sermon. They walked into town. She wore the blue dress with red stitching. He wore the coat she'd patched for him months ago. People stared. The mayor waited in the town square, flanked by 2 deputies, and a minister brought in from another town. He wore black gloves and a smile like rotted fruit. "You've come to your senses," he said. Etta stopped 5 paces from him. "No, I've come to make sure no other girl stands where I stood." Gasps. A few murmurs. The mayor chuckled. "You think they'll listen to you?" Callum stepped forward then. Not looming, just present. "She's not asking." The mayor turned to the crowd. "You want her to return to the pit? Is that what she wants?" Etta raised her voice, not loud, but clear. "I want to tell you what happened." The preacher stepped forward. "Let her speak." And so she did. She told them of the sash that burned, the chains that bruised, the song the fiddler played while she screamed. She told them of the silence that followed, how no one came, not to stop it, not to apologize. She told them of the barn, the snow, the boots by the door, the slow return of her breath. She didn't ask for sympathy. She offered memory. "You didn't throw me into fire," she said. "You watched. That's what I'll remember." The mayor turned red. "Enough. I won't be tried by a seamstress and a mute farmer." Etta smiled faintly. "You already were." And then something happened. One by one, the townsfolk looked away. Not at her, not at the mayor, just away, because they remembered. The mayor barked for the deputies to arrest her. They didn't move. Callum placed a hand on Etta's shoulder, not to protect, just to anchor. The preacher stepped forward, pulled the ring from his coat. "The fire you lit burned more than fabric." The mayor reached for it. The preacher dropped it into the mud. That's when the mayor raised his hand. But Callum caught his wrist midair. Not violently, just firmly. "No," Callum said. A single word. And the mayor, for the first time, looked unsure. Not afraid, just confused. As if he realized the story he'd written was no longer his. He turned, walked away. No applause followed. No cheers. Only silence. The kind that comes after a sermon no one expected to hear. Etta exhaled. Callum watched her. Not as a savior, not as a witness, but as someone who believed. They left the square hand in hand. Not lovers, not legends, just 2 people who refused to be erased. That evening, on the porch, Etta said quietly, "I thought healing would feel like fire leaving the skin." Callum looked at her. "It feels like choosing who you are, even after they tried to decide for you." She nodded. The wind carried their breath into the dark. The town didn't cheer, but it changed. And sometimes, that's louder than fire. The mayor did not forget. That Sunday, when Etta stood before the town in her blue dress stitched with fire, when the people looked away and the silence turned against him, that wound festered. Pride is a brittle thing when bent in public, and for men like him, humiliation wasn't a wound. It was war. He began quietly. Letters to the sheriff, whispers to the judge, claims of trespassing, rumors that Callum had harbored a fugitive, that the barn was a den for wickedness, that a burned girl with no papers and a man with no friends made for easy villains if you tilted the story just right. By midweek, 2 deputies rode out under cloudy skies with orders to arrest them both. Callum saw them before they crossed the ridge. He didn't reach for his rifle. Instead, he knocked once on the barn door and said, "We need to go." Etta didn't ask why. She already knew. They rode together. Callum on his old roan gelding, Etta behind on the black mare he hadn't touched since his wife died. The trail was soft with melted snow, and the pine trees leaned in like watchers. Every few miles, they paused to listen. No birds, no wind, just the sound of old footsteps, finally leaving where they'd once been buried. They stopped by a stream as the sun folded itself behind the hills. Callum lit a small fire. Etta unwrapped a jar of dried apples from her coat. They shared them without words. That night, under a quilt of stars, she whispered, "Do you think they'll follow?" Callum stirred the fire. "I think they already have." She looked at him. "Then why didn't you bring a gun?" He met her gaze. because I don't want you to remember this chapter with blood in it. In the morning, they reached the canyon, a narrow cut in the hills where the land bowed inward, and the light took longer to rise. Callum knew the terrain. He'd hunted here once, long ago, when he still believed the world could be made quiet through distance. But the mayor didn't come for quiet. He came for correction. He came with 6 men, rifles drawn, boots heavy, and a face that smiled like winter pretending to be spring. They didn't shout, didn't announce themselves, just emerged from the trees like regret made flesh. Etta saw them first. Her breath caught, but she didn't run. Callum stepped forward. He held no weapon, only his body between her and the men. The mayor dismounted. "End of the road, widow," he said, spitting toward the fire. Callum didn't answer. The mayor turned to Etta. "You think you embarrassed me, that you won. But women like you don't win. You forget your place. You get put back into it." She stepped around Callum then, slowly, deliberately. "I haven't forgotten my place," she said. "I just don't take orders from the fire anymore." The mayor's smirk twisted. "You're still a nothing seamstress. Burnt, unmarried, dirt poor." Etta took another step forward. "Yet here you are, bringing 6 men to chase someone you claim doesn't matter. Funny how ghosts haunt the ones who try to bury them alive." One of the men behind the mayor shifted. Uneasy. Callum saw it. He saw all of it, the cracks forming in the mayor's performance. The way Etta's voice didn't shake. The way the fire behind her didn't flicker. The mayor stepped closer, raising a hand as if to strike. Callum moved, but Etta's hand caught his wrist first. "No," she said softly. "Let him do it." The mayor's hand hovered, hung in the air, but she didn't flinch, didn't blink. He stared at her like she'd turned to stone. Then something in him wilted. Because what power is left in a man who tries to set fire to someone who no longer burns? He lowered his hand. "Get on your horse," she said, "before the mountain remembers your name." The men looked to each other. One by one, they turned their horses, rode back in silence. The mayor was last. He hesitated, like he wanted to say something, like he still needed to rewrite the ending. But he didn't. He left, and when the hoofbeats faded, Callum let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Etta stood there, still watching the trees. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She simply turned and sat by the fire, picked up a stick, and stirred the embers. "Do you know," she said, "when I was 13, I tried to burn a dress just to see what it felt like." Callum knelt beside her. "It screamed," she said. "Cloth does that when it burns. I never tried again, but I never forgot the sound." He didn't speak, just took her hand, and for the first time, she let him. They returned to the ranch a day later. No one came after them. The sheriff resigned 2 weeks later. The mayor was never seen in town again. Some say he moved east. Others say he drowned in the river that spring. No one cared enough to check. But in town, the story changed. It wasn't about a girl thrown in fire anymore. It was about the woman who walked back without smoke on her skin and spoke the truth, so hard it cracked the sky. Etta began sewing again. Not for others, for herself. Curtains, a shawl, a red ribbon she tied in her hair. Callum fixed the barn door, built a fence around the garden she'd started before the snow. One morning, she placed a carved bird on the windowsill. His carving. He didn't ask if it meant anything. He just sat beside her on the porch and watched the sky change. She turned to him. "Do you ever wonder what your wife would think?" He blinked, swallowed. "All the time." She nodded. "I hope she'd be proud of the quiet man who never raised a fist, but stood taller than any tree I've ever seen." He didn't answer, but he reached for her hand again, and this time, she laced her fingers with his. The fire never returned, but warmth did, not in flames, in footsteps, in shared silence, in sound of stitches pulled through cloth, and names spoken gently into dusk. And if you pass that ranch now, just beyond the ridge where the pines bow and the creek sings, you might see a porch, 2 chairs, 1 quilt, and a woman in a red ribbon who no longer walks like a girl risen from flame, because she wasn't born to burn, She was born to build from ash.